You do something new, and that's informative, right? There's information in the action, and then you can incorporate that information and turn it into a skill and turn it into a transformation of your perceptions. So there's more to you because you've tried something new. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, and there's good biological evidence for this now, that if you put yourself in a new situation, then new genes code for new proteins and build new neural structures and new nervous system structures. Same thing happens to some degree when you work out, right? Because your muscles are responding to the load, but your nervous system does that too. So you imagine that there's a lot of potential you locked in your genetic code. And then if you put yourself in a new situation, then the stress, that's the situational stress that's produced by that particular situation, unlocks those genes and then builds new parts of you. And so that's very cool, because who knows how much there is locked inside of you. Okay, so now here's the idea. So let's assume that scales as you take on heavier and heavier loads. That more and more of you get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked. And so then what that would imply is that if you got to the point where you could look at the darkest things, so that would be the abyss, right? That would be the deepest abyss. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would turn you on maximally. And so that's the idea of rescuing your father, because imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. Because you're like the, what would you call it? You're the consequence of all these living beings that have come before you, and that's all part of your biological potentiality. And then if you can push yourself, then all of that clicks on, and that turns you into who you could be. That's the re-representation of that positive ancestral father. So that's why you rescue your father from the belly of the beast. The world's full of suffering, and you should accept that as your responsibility. Past, present, and future. You're supposed to do something about that, as much as you can about it. And maybe you start with your own localized suffering, put yourself together, but then you expand that outward and you decide that you're not a victim of that, even though, you're part and parcel of it, but you're the potential solution to that. And so you accept that as a responsibility. So that's part of taking on a load. That's part of bearing a cross. You could look at it that way. The cross is sort of a symbol of the place of maximal suffering. Okay, so you accept that as a challenge, not as something that you're victimized by. Maybe you accept that as the price of being. Okay, so that's one responsibility. You're responsible for addressing the suffering in the world. So that could give you some meaning, seems to me. And then the next thing is, there's a story, of course, that Christ met the devil in the desert, and so that's the encounter with malevolence. So that would be the other thing, because the two major problems that people face, obviously, are suffering, tragedy, and malevolence. And so that's the other thing that you're responsible for, is that you're supposed to look at the capacity for human evil as clearly as you possibly can, which is a very terrifying thing. That causes post-traumatic stress disorder in people that aren't accustomed to it. And in the mythology that's associated with the encounter with evil, it's almost always the case that the entity that does the encountering, even if it does it voluntarily, is hurt by it. So the Egyptian god Horus, for example, who's the eye and the falcon, the thing that can see and pay attention, when he encounters his evil uncle Seth, who's the precursor of Satan, he loses an eye, because it's no joke to encounter malevolence. It can really shake you. But the idea would be that if you can face the malevolence and you can face the suffering, then that opens the door to your maximal potential. And then the optimistic part of that is, and this is why it's so useful to peer into the darkness, let's say, the optimistic part of that is that although the suffering is great and the malevolence is deep, your capacity to transcend it is stronger. So what you get out of the most negative viewpoint is the most positive possible consequence. Because one of the things you'd like to know, if you wanted to know something deep about yourself, is that you could face the worst that there was and prevail. And I believe that people are capable of that. I think that despite how tragic life is and how malevolent things are, that fundamentally our spirit, let's say, has the capacity to confront that and to fix it, like psychologically, so to confront it courageously, to be able to bear up under that if you do it voluntarily, but also to address it. Not only to deal with it psychologically, but to deal with it practically. And that we could make things much better.
There's always a striving towards utopia, right? Like, this is the ultimate goal, that if you ask people, what would you like out of civilization? Well, I'd like everyone to be happy and everyone to get along, and there to be no war, nothing, no suffering, no anything. But in order to really truly learn about yourself and about life, you have to overcome adversity. You have to experience things. And I firmly believe that in order to truly appreciate love, you have to understand and really have felt hate. And to really appreciate camaraderie, you have to feel loneliness. So this is just a part of being a person, for whatever reason. Like,
because we're not stupid. We know you can't have everything at the same time. If you have any sense, you're lucky if you get some things that are good at once, you know. So we're very grateful to have that opportunity, and that I was going to continue to do this as long as I was thrilled to be in front of the audience, and then when I meet people afterwards, that I'm not looking at the end of the line to see when the night ends, you know, because I want to be sure that every single person that comes to meet me, I'm, you know, present for. Absolutely, because I am actually quite taken aback and thrilled, I guess, is the right word. Grateful? That's better.
Yes.
That they're there. It's like, God, man, some of these people, you know, like they're coming from all over the place. You know, people fly in from Australia into Europe. They've flown, lots of Eastern Europeans came to England. In fact, they're making huge treks. There was guys who came from they took them like 12 hours to get through Russia to come to Finland to watch the talk there. You know, and then not just a few people like that. People are really going way the hell out of their way, you know, and then they line up, and it's not inexpensive, because these venues are expensive. And
like, there's something distasteful if you go to someone's page and they just retweet all the positive things that people say to them, because then it has this sort of reinforcing side. Like, people know that if I say something really positive to Jordan, he's going to retweet me. Like, there are some people that they engage in this sort of commerce. You know, like, you say something positive, they retweet you, and you know, it's a little too strokey,
right?
You know? People get really into that, stroking their own back.
Yeah. Well, I guess the danger of that is that possibility of that ego inflation that you really want to avoid, because that's a bad idea. That's a very bad idea.
Well, you've done a wonderful job of avoiding those waters, because this is for a guy who's in his 50s, who becomes famous out of nowhere, and doesn't just become famous, but becomes this culturally significant sort of lightning rod. I mean, that's how I view you, and a lot of these talks that you're doing, a lot of these debates like you're having with this woman at GQ, or some of your interviews. What you're doing is you're expressing yourself in a brave but very controversial way, and a lot of people are paying attention to this, but then you're backing it up with your research, you're backing it up with real science, you're backing up with a tremendous amount of history of the human race, and of religion, and of the scientific studies that have been done that show correlations between different types of behaviors in human beings. And all this is rich. It's very rewarding if you could take it all in. But when it goes against what people have, their preconceived notions or their own set of beliefs that they're bringing to your conversations, to your debates, then it creates this hostile battle where what you're saying is very contrary to the way they've been living their life.